Hi folks, I'm Derek Olson, a biblical scholar with a love for liturgy. Welcome to a liturgical look forward for the week of Proper 6 in Year 2 of the Daily Office Lectionary. So each week we look at the scripture readings that are appointed for morning and evening prayer from the Episcopal Book of Common Prayer, which are the same readings that you'll find in the popular Forward Day by Day devotional from Forward Movement. All right, so looking at Proper 6, let's jump right into our first readings for this week. So this is going to be our first full week in the Book of Numbers. We actually started this book last Saturday, but this week is really where we kind of dive into it big time. Okay, so in terms of the big picture, even bigger than what you see here, Numbers is the fourth book of the Old Testament, of the Bible as a whole. So in the first book, right, Genesis, that's where we have the patriarchs, and we get Israel into Egypt through Joseph. Then the next book, Exodus, is Moses getting Israel out of Egypt and the arrival at Mount Sinai, and that's where God makes a covenant with Israel through Moses. Then the third book is Leviticus, so that's mostly laws about how the Israelites are supposed to live in a covenant relationship with God. And then finally we get to Numbers, which is our fourth book. So in Numbers, we're going to finally leave Mount Sinai, which we've been at for the last book and a half, and we'll start wandering through the desert towards the Promised Land. There's going to be some legal material in here, some genealogy stuff in here, but there's also going to be a lot of whining and a lot of wandering. The generation that leaves Egypt is going to whine quite a lot about how much better things were in Egypt, and that's going to be the cause of the wandering. So if you pray morning prayer on a regular basis, then you should at least know about the verses that we cut out of Psalm 95. So at the end of Psalm 95, we lose this particular segment of verses. Oh, that today you would hearken to his voice. We keep that, but then this is what we lose. Harden not your hearts, as your forebears did in the wilderness, at Meribah, and on that day at Massah, when they tempted me. They put me to the test, though they had seen my works. 40 years long I detested that generation and said, this people are wayward in their hearts. They do not know my ways. So I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter into my rest. All right, so that section that we normally cut out of Psalm 95 at morning prayer, that's essentially the story of Numbers in a nutshell. So it's waywardness and whining, wrath and wandering. So basically the old generation has to die off, and then the new generation is going to possess the land. So if you look at the overall shape of Numbers, it falls into two big halves. The old generation is chapters 1 through 20, and then the new generation is chapters 21 through 36. All right, let's look at our readings for this week. So this week we're going to be in that first section where we're hearing about the unfaithfulness of the old generation. There are two big events here: whining because of a lack of food and water, and then whining because when they spy out the land of Canaan, the inhabitants look really big and scary. As you can see, we've got quite a few gaps as we read through Numbers this week. Some gaps, like chapter 7, you should be really thankful for. This is a combination of genealogy and legal stuff, where we hear a list of the heads of the 12 tribes and 14 different items that they bring to the tabernacle to offer. And since they're all bringing the exact same 14 things, this gets very repetitive very quickly. But as you can see, we're also skipping some legal material about the Nazarites, stuff about the Levites as well. So let's go ahead and move on to our second reading then. All right, this week we are going to be moving into the book of Romans. So Romans is the longest letter to a single church in the New Testament. This is often considered to be Paul's most important letter, and certainly Protestants have tended to treat it in that way from the time of Luther on. We're going to be in Romans for the next 6 weeks, so we can go ahead and settle in because we're going to be here for a while. I've already mentioned Romans several times in this series, even though this is the first time that we're actually diving into it. Paul was a church planter and a church developer. So a lot of the letters that we have from him are letters to churches that he knows well and that know him well. It may be sometimes a bit too well. That's one of the big issues in the Corinthian correspondence. Romans is an important letter because he's writing to a church that he didn't plant and he doesn't know. So remember the concerns in 2nd and 3rd John that we read a few weeks ago about the wandering teachers and how you've got to be careful in picking them? That's exactly what this is. This is Paul's letter of recommendation, basically saying, "Hi, I'm Paul. I'm a Christian teacher who teaches good stuff. I'd like you to sponsor me to come and teach there. Here's the kind of stuff I teach. You can see that it's just like the kind of stuff that you already teach. And hey, I know a bunch of people there, and we've got all kinds of friends in common." So, a couple of things. First, this letter, Romans, is Paul communicating his teaching in a nutshell. That's one of the reasons this letter is so important. It's literally a witness to the apostolic faith as Paul understands it. Second, Paul is writing a letter to a church he didn't plant and where he's never visited, which means this isn't just an idiosyncratic picture of the faith. This can't just be what Paul teaches. Instead, he must be demonstrating continuity with broader early Christian belief. Otherwise, if this were just Paul's own idiosyncratic take on things, the Roman church would look at this letter and say, "This is crazy. This isn't what we believe. So, no, we're not going to pay for this guy to come and stay here." So, we can be confident that in the broad strokes, Paul is not teaching anything wacky here. This isn't just Paul's version of the apostolic faith. This is the big picture. This is the content of the apostolic faith with certain Pauline nuances and emphases that the Roman church who doesn't know Paul is going to agree with. All right, so if we look at Romans as a whole here, we can split it kind of into 6 big chunks. So we have an opening, then Paul lays out the need for salvation in chapters 2 and 3. 4 through 8, he's talking about righteousness and justification. So how God accomplishes salvation in and through the church and the sacraments. Then in 9 through 11, he's got kind of an excursus on Israel and the church. We'll talk more about that as we get into those in the week of Proper 9. Then in 12 through the middle of 15, he talks about the new life in Christ and what Christian living looks like in light of the church and the sacraments. Then finally, he closes the letter with an extended section of shout-outs that show the importance of social networks in early Christianity. That's chapter 16 in particular. All right, what we're going to be reading for this upcoming week is the first 2 sections. So Paul's opening, and then him laying out why Christians need to be saved and what it is we need to be saved from. The real heart of what Paul is going to be fussing with for the next couple of weeks is in a thesis statement that he lays out there at the beginning of our section that we'll read on Tuesday. So in chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. "For in it the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith." And so this is what he's going to be working out then the next upcoming weeks as he works through these chapters. When we look at our readings here, you see that we are reading through Romans pretty continuously except for 2 verses. One little gap. Yeah, it's a little gap. It's also a big gap. Because this is the couple of verses in Romans that are sometimes used as a clobber verse in the whole debate about homosexuality and the church. All right, first off, understanding Paul's larger argument here is essential, and in particular, you've got to know that in this section at the end of chapter 1, he's riffing on a couple of chapters out of the Wisdom of Solomon. Now, to us, the Wisdom of Solomon is Apocrypha. To Paul and the Romans, it was simply Bible. The whole argument that he's making here is the idea that God and the idea of God is implicit through creation, and that idolatry in all of its forms, and Paul understands sexual licentiousness, including homosexuality, as a fruit of idolatry. So all idolatry is a deliberate rejection of the self-evident fact of God as creator, and therefore the one due praise and worship because of creation. So he's setting up idolatry, and he's connecting sexual practice as part of idolatry. We could go into this at great length, but we don't have the time for that at the moment. So that's point 1. Point 2, yes, the lectionary here in our 1979 Common Book of Common Prayer skips these 2 verses. It's important to know that this is not new to this prayer book. So it gets skipped also in the Daily Office Lectionary Revision in 1943. But the first time that it got skipped was in the revision of 1928. So here's a screenshot of a prayer book that was printed in 1929, so before that 43 revision. As you can see, we've got an in-course reading of Romans here in Epiphany Tide. On Monday there, we're reading Romans 1, 1 to 13. On Tuesday, we read Romans 1, 14 to 25. Then on Wednesday, we skip to Romans chapter 2, verse 1 through 16. Then there's also an in-course reading of Romans during Trinity Tide. And here in the 13th Sunday after Trinity, we're reading Romans 1, 1 to 25, and then we go directly into Romans 2. So, if you'd like, you can rail against the modernism of the new prayer book and its selective fidelity to the faith, but the prayer book that you'd be railing against is the 1928 prayer book, not the 1979. All right, that's enough on the second readings. Let's go ahead and move on to our third readings. Okay, so this week we are heading through Matthew with no gaps. We're going to finish up a doing section with some healing, and then we're going to move into a talking section. So chapter 18 is broadly about how we live in Christian community. So we start off by a discussion of not scandalizing or offending or sinning against little ones. This means children. Don't sin against children. But also it means those new in the faith. So little ones is also young or new Christians as well as children. Then this naturally leads into discussions of how Christians should address and resolve conflict when possible. And then that naturally leads into the topic of forgiveness. And so chapter 18 as a whole is concerned with these issues of how we live together. Then with chapter 19, we have a scene change because we're moving from Galilee into the Transjordan area. And then the Pharisees start talking with Jesus about a variety of things. Their first topic is divorce, and that's what we're going to hit on Saturday. And that's where we wrap it up for this week. So, if you'd like to pray the daily office online, I'd encourage you to check out the St. Bede's Breviary at breviary.stbede'sproductions.com or stop by prayer.forwardmovement.org, where you can find the daily office, but also the readings and reflections from Forward Day by Day. I want to give a big thank you to my Patreon supporters. If you're not a supporter yet, come on over and join us. There's a link in the show notes. And while you're down there, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Give me a thumbs up, and let me know what you think of the show in the comments. See you next week.